So I think it's time to get this session underway. It's my pleasure to be chairing this public lecture this evening. So it is a public lecture, and I'm very pleased to welcome any members of the public who've come to join us on this occasion, as well as people from the conference who've come back for yet another session. If there are fresh ears to help with the listening process, you're very welcome to join us. The programme said that this session was going to finish at 9 o'clock, but that was a mistake. It was intended to say 9:30, but my instinct is always to compromise, so I'm suggesting that we finish at 9:15. So we'll keep things a little bit succinct, but we'll allow ourselves slightly more than an hour. And it's a great pleasure to be introducing Professor Michael Reiss, who is giving this public lecture this evening. He's Professor of Science Education at the UCL Institute of Education, visiting professor at various other places as well, and also president of the International Association for Science and Religion in Schools. I think he's quite well known for having got into a controversy 10 years ago about the teaching of creationism, and he was widely misrepresented as having advocated the teaching of creationism in science lessons. In fact, all he said was that if a student asks about creation in a science lesson, it's best to explain why it has no scientific basis rather than just say, we can't talk about that. But I think that position was widely misunderstood at the time. And a little later, he led a delegation of science educators to the Minister of Education to complain about evolution having been left off the primary school curriculum. So those are examples of the kind of public events that Michael has got engaged in. But I'm not going to take up any more of the time by introducing him. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to give this public lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, we'll get going. As Fraser said, very good of people to be here. For some of you, it's been a long day. And to reiterate, as far as I'm concerned, we will finish by 9:15 at the latest. And if anybody already has arrangements for things after 9, just leave after 9. I will slightly compress what I prepared, but there will still be plenty of time for questions, comments, and discussions. Just to make one or two obvious but heartfelt thank yous, perhaps, especially to Donovan and to Fraser, representing the IRC and the ISSR, for the enormous amount of work that goes into this. And if I can also say, I've really enjoyed the meals, both for the company and the excellent food. So it's been a very good conference so far, and thank you to Oxford and St Anne's for hosting us. A final thing I'd say is that one of the hats I wear, as Fraser indicated, is being involved with the ISSR, and you will have got, if you're coming here because you're part of the conference, you'll have got one of these leaflets. And one of the things the Society has done in the last year is to have a new category of membership. Mostly, we have fellows who are invited to join, basically along the lines of any elite academy, but we now have associates as well. So if you feel comfortable with what we're doing, and you can find out on the website, or there's an email address there, you can email Harris Wiseman, the administrator, then you are welcome to pay a subscription and join as an associate, which has various benefits. Right, this is meant to be slightly more education-focused than the other plenaries we've had, hence the title, Religion, Society and the Science of Life, Implications for Public and School Education. As is well known, the tremendous growth in the life sciences over the last 100 years or so has had major implications for religion and for theology too. But the implications of that for education have been less widely considered. I will, however, before I get on to education, just make clear some of what these issues are that I'm going to be concerned about. And I'll be focusing on the implications of Darwinian biology, evolutionary psychology, and contemporary theories of sexuality for human behavior. Now, the beauty of Darwinian biology, if you just set aside occasional, important, but basically sidelines like genetic drift and things like that, the beauty is that natural selection, Darwinian evolution, has one end, one purpose, one aim, roughly speaking, and we've had several talks already about this conference, leaving copies in future succeeding generations. And that is as true whether we're thinking of all the cells that make up a beautiful animal like a cheetah, or if we're thinking of an impressive organism like an oak tree. But it's also true, of course, of organisms that we don't instinctively feel quite as keen on. So as most of you will know, Darwin himself was quite troubled because he was a sensitive soul. He obviously seems to be a rather nice man about the ichneumon fly, which exists by, and I'm not going to go for dimming lights and all that sort of thing. You can get the idea. It exists by injecting its eggs into caterpillars. Those slides are quite easy to find on the internet. I don't know if even the internet is quite squeamish. If you look a bit harder, you can see what happens, because this is the point of it from the ichneumon fly's point of view. The aim of life, loosely speaking, is to leave lots of copies of ichneumon flies. And these caterpillars are just very useful means to that end. So these are its babies. I think even I'm, after the large number of sweets I ate, going to move on quickly to the next slide. So that's one point about Darwinian evolution. It has one end. In that sense, it's a little bit like the theory of gravity, if I dare say so. You have one simple, powerful theory which applies just as much to the beautiful night sky, which most of us enjoy, as it does to dropping cluster bombs on Syria, which is what that is a photograph of. The same principle applies. Now, that fairly obviously leads into questions, which again we've had addressed in some of the plenaries, the most recent one, and indeed to a certain extent last night, about evolutionary morality. Because, of course, the simplest way to start off thinking about it is that evolutionary morality is the evolution of patterns of behavior which actually are fundamentally forms of self-interest. So when we admire the way, for example, that parent birds protect their fledglings, well, most of us, when push comes to shove, tend to do that if we have children, actually. And it's a pretty instinctive thing to do, and it makes total sense in terms of natural selection. So I would go as far as to say is the overwhelming majority of animal behavior that looks like what most sensible, ordinary people would call altruism, being helpful, is pure self-interest, where we can have a slight academic discussion about what's meant by self, but it's basically all about getting copies into succeeding generations. And that links into favouring of kin, which again we had addressed in our preceding public lecture. Kin selection, as we were told quite rightly, having been the term coined by John Maynard Smith, following on from W.D. Hamilton's slightly more abstruse way of thinking about the same issues. But the downside, of course, is that if you favour your kin, your brothers, your sisters, your parents, your children, the wider circle of relatives, you do not, at least to the same extent, favour your non-relatives. And we could have the whole of the rest of the discussion now about the links, therefore, between that and explanations in humans of xenophobia and racism. Some of you will know, but possibly not all of you, that about 30 years ago, evolutionary biologists then started to think quite seriously about the evolution of self-deception. Now, in a way, self-deception has been part and parcel of, for example, literature for hundreds of years, and many people's thinking for millennia. But evolutionary biologists were particularly interested in how humans, it would be argued by most evolutionary biologists, have evolved under certain circumstances to deceive themselves. And the reason, of course, is that the actor who believes that the role that they are playing is reality is a good actor. That's the point of self-deception. If you or I feel deeply upset that somebody else has cut us up on a motorway or whatever, we go into self-justificatory mode. And one set of explanations would say that goes back to Darwinian self-interest. Finally, another example, sexual attractiveness. Most evolutionary biologists, when they're quite young, write about issues to do with mate choice and sexual behavior. As they get older, they start writing about feeding behaviors. But those are pretty much the only two things that evolutionary biologists write about. Because apart from escaping predators, that's pretty much, for most organisms, the crucial things. If you're a sexual species, finding somebody else who is prepared with you to have the next generation and getting enough food and not being eaten. Initially, of course, because 30, 40 years ago, most of the people in the field were males, the emphasis seemed very much to be on what men were doing, and males and other species. Thankfully then, of course, we got a group of feminist sociobiologists and evolutionary biologists who started on pointing out, hang on a sec, and now it's pretty well accepted within the discipline that there are separate strategies in all species for females and for males, and sometimes they're quite close, and sometimes they're very divergent, and that leads to a lot of interesting empirical studies. Now, for those of you who are beginning to think, crumbs, you know, that all sounds a bit sort of reductionist, a bit naive, that's the point I want, of course, to make. This is a simplified story for human behavior, and that is what caused the ire of anthropologists and others in the 1980s against sociobiology. There are some people in the audience who've written more about this and know more about this than I do, but as somebody who lived through it all, one remembers reading with incredulity both sides of the argument, because it just seemed like the usual story of neither person really understanding the points the other one was making. One was a young discipline, and young intellectual disciplines almost always overextend themselves and people get enthusiastic. Others were well-established disciplines which sometimes have the equal fault of becoming condescending towards new disciplines. Human behavior goes way beyond naked Darwinian self-interest. That is precisely what makes us the most interesting species in the world. It's not just that we're humans and we think we are the most interesting. From the point of view of any biologist, we are the most interesting. Sexual desire, as I suspect probably all of us will be prepared to agree, is not all about having children. And yet when one reads certainly the early writings of sociobiologists, it's as if sex was only to do with having children. And it's not. One of the crucial things about a lot of interesting things in humans, and I was talking about, for instance, at dinner tonight with Vanessa Matthews and Peter Woodhead about this, all three of us were talking about how a lot of the interesting things about humans are rooted, as it were, in conventional evolutionary biologists. No, that was a slip of the tongue. Rooted in conventional evolutionary biology, but part of being human is that we can transcend those origins. So to give a couple more examples, I am somebody who thinks people are perfectly capable of real altruism. There was a slightly surreal bit of history about 20 years ago in the 90s when some sociobiologists tried to argue that nobody was altruistic. Everybody was doing it out of self-interest. Now, at one extreme, this shows the power of abstract thinking in the human mind, how you can end up completely defending something which actually most people just know is not true. And I don't think it's true either. People do act in ways that are not in their self-interest, and in everyday language, and indeed in the world's religions, the issue of who is my neighbor, who is my kin, is a central one. And the point of the question is that we should not just be bound by self-interest. And then again, as came up, and I wrote this slide before I'd heard any of the talks the last couple of days, but the fascinating thing also about the human mind is that it's got complicated enough that it's no longer satisfied with behaving in ways that are just to do with self-interest. So if you think of something like human perception, it evolved so we could leave more copies of ourselves. But the best way of doing that is to actually be able to see the natural world fairly accurately in some respects. But there are other parts of the mind where the best way to leave copies of ourselves is not to see things accurately, objectively, but with self-discipline, education, the right support from others, one can think rationally, grow into rationality. Okay, the relevance of all this for education. I'm going to say a bit, but I'm going to concentrate on school education, partly for reasons of time, partly because while other sorts of education, for example, museums, writings, TV, the internet are important, They're not quite as important probably for most of us as school education, and indeed they're subject to fewer strictures than are schools, so schools are quite a good place to concentrate on the key issues. What should schools be doing? Just to say one or two obvious things, the crucial thing about schools is they employ people, mainly teachers, and have certain resources which allow students access to knowledge, powerful knowledge, that is much more difficult to obtain outside of a school. So I do believe schools are partnerships between parents, extended communities, and the teachers for the mutual benefit of the children, the students that are being educated. Schools have a special duty, it's a bit like public sector broadcasting, for balance and impartiality. Okay? One might accept certain newspapers pushing boundaries a bit more than would be considered appropriate for school textbooks, to give a very obvious example. Schools, of course, play a role in socialization. They play a role, therefore, in moral education. That starts with the family. Indeed, in most ways, families are more important than are schools for moral education, unlike acquisition of powerful knowledge. But schools play a role as well, partly because they're quite large numbers of children together usually, and you can learn things in groups you can't learn in just your families. And then perhaps especially important in linking in with my points about Darwinian evolution, schools should enable critical faculties in the true sense of the term, in other words, thinking deeply, rigorously about all sorts of things, precisely because of the fact otherwise we get a bit lazy, we're sloppy in our thinking, and indeed we're quite capable of deceiving ourselves. I could, of course, talk about the function of schooling for a much longer period of time. My own view is that the best way to start is to see schools as contributing to human flourishing, and indeed, to a certain extent, for example, when teaching geography, environmental education, biology, and so on, citizenship, moral education, non-human flourishing. And one of the particular things schools should be able to do is to help students to imagine possibilities. That's one of the things good teachers can do, and that enlarges the mind. If one thinks of any of the world's great literature that you read as a teenager, it's about introducing you often to situations you wouldn't have imagined otherwise. Most literature is about human relationships or existential questions, and it's good for schools to introduce those. Even something like work experience, and countries vary, but in England, when you're about 15 or so, you often have a couple of weeks where you're sent off into the real world for a couple of weeks of work experience. It's usually done rather badly, but when it's done well, it allows students to get experience of a place they wouldn't otherwise go to. Now, I thought I'd try and make some of this a bit more concrete. What should schools be doing about religion? I've got two more chunks in what I'm going to say. This is one of the chunks, and then the other chunk is some empirical data from a research project. So this first chunk, I wanted to start with one or two overall points. This is set in the context, of course, that there are huge differences between countries. I'm very aware in the position of religious education in schools. So in the US, in France, at the moment in Turkey, for how long, who knows, roughly speaking, you have a secular school system in which religion, insofar as it is taught at all, is only taught as necessary for an understanding of history in particular, and to a certain extent literature, and occasionally one or two other subjects. Then, of course, you have a number of theocracies where just one religion is taught in schools and is taught as the truth. So, for example, quite a lot of Arab countries, that, of course, is how Islam is taught. England is unusual compared to most countries, so it's not unique in requiring religion to be taught in schools, but in no longer pushing, advocating one particular religion, or indeed any religion. And I happen to be rather keen on where we've got to in England. So there are then all sorts of aims for RE, but the main aim probably in England we would see is something about enable people better to understand what's meant by religion, how it's practiced, the good that it can do, the bad that it can do, what it's like if you don't have a religious faith to have one, if you do have a religious faith, what it might be like not to have one. There's been a movement in science education, which is a large part of my day-to-day work, on what's called the big ideas. And this is because for those of you who were taught science at school but then gave it up as soon as you could, you may belong to the rather large group of people who find that school science consisted of vast numbers of scattered bits of information. And it wasn't always very obvious, why am I learning this? So there's been a move in science education to try to get towards some big ideas, like, for example, particle theory, and then making sure that students can master that and helping them to realize why both intellectually and technically it's a very beautiful and useful body of knowledge. Much more recently, there's the beginnings of movement for big ideas in religious education, and that's what I just wanted to share some with you. It's a project led by Barbara Winterskill, who's an honorary fellow at the University of Exeter, and its overall aim, and slightly to my surprise I was asked to chair it, is that schools, through their religious education programs, should aim systematically to prepare students for the spiritual and intellectual challenges of living in a world with diverse religions and beliefs as well as non-belief. So that's a slightly more formal way of saying what I said a minute or two ago. Very different from what happens in a number of other countries, as some of you here will know very well indeed, but actually not very different from what's happened the last 20 or so years in terms of overall aims in the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. And I'm just going to now give you a sort of headlines about the 6 big ideas that the rather large group, which like all of these groups had a mixture of academics in theology, experts in school teaching of RE, teachers, advisors, and so on. So one big idea, and I'll just read it out to you, headed Continuity, Change and Diversity, is that religions and non-religious worldviews, that would include humanism, but could even include, things like Marxism, some people would argue, involve interconnected patterns of beliefs, practices, and values. They are also highly diverse and change in response to new situations and challenges. These patterns of diversity and change can be the cause of debate, tension, and conflict, or result in new creative developments. And that's one of the things students in schools find very difficult, by the way, in science as well in religion. The idea about continuity and the idea about change, helping them to realize in science that some ideas are very well established and can be relied on, while others at the sort of boundary, the penumbra of science, are advancing all the time. And in the same way, most religions have certain sort of core beliefs, if you like, but then there's a huge amount of contestation about belief, a huge range of practices, and quite a diversity of values. So one just has to think about the religion I know best, which is within the Protestant tradition of Christianity, the Church of England. We have been succeeding probably for decades in tearing ourselves apart in arguments to do with gender and sexuality. Big idea 2, words and beyond. Many people find it difficult to express their deepest beliefs, feelings, emotions, and religious experiences using everyday language. Instead, they may use a variety of different approaches, including figurative language and a range of literary genres. In addition, people use non-verbal forms of communication, such as art, music, drama, and dance, that seek to explain or illustrate religious or non-religious ideas or experiences. There are different ways of interpreting both verbal and non-verbal forms of expression, etc., etc. Now, within some religions, like, for example, Judaism and Christianity, that's an easier idea to help school children to understand because, of course, the canons of Scripture include such a range of genres within them. You don't get many people reading the Song of Songs, for example, only literally, although originally that was that much how it was meant. Similarly, one reads Proverbs differently from how one reads 2 Kings or something like that. Within other religions, of course, a very obvious example being Islam, there is not quite the range of genres within the canon of Scripture, so within the Quran. A good life. Many religions and non-religious communities strive to live according to what they understand as a good life. Their members share an understanding as to the sort of characteristics and behaviours a good person will seek to achieve, as well as dealing with what is, or is not, acceptable moral behaviour. People have different ideas about how and why we should lead a good life. The ideal is usually presented in the lives and character of exemplary members. There may be considerable agreement across different religions and non-religious worldviews on some matters, and considerable differences on others. And then there's a bit more there. So that, roughly speaking, is the sort of ethics and morality part of whether it's humanism or any of the world's major religions. It's often the bit in England that school students most enjoy in their RE lessons when they're not taught by very expert teachers. In other words, it's more difficult to enthuse students quite often about other parts of RE than it is about ethics and morality. Making sense of life's experiences. Many people have deeply felt experiences which they may refer to as being religious or spiritual or simply part of what it means to be human. These experiences may result in their undergoing transformative change, and on rare occasions the experience of a single person has led to the formation of a new religion or worldview. Through religious rituals and other practices, people sometimes experience a deep connection with God or gods, nature, their own consciousness, or with each other. This can give them a heightened sense of awareness and mystery. Many people find that belonging to religious or non-religious groups of others who share their beliefs, values, and traditions gives them a sense of identity and belonging. So that's fairly clear, I think, in what it says. Only 2 more, and can I say, which I'm not going to the detail here, of course, all of these are then broken down for what one might hope to do with 5 and 6-year-olds, then 7 to 11-year-olds, 12 to 14-year-olds, and 15 to 16-year-olds. So there's a progression, because one of the great problems with RE teaching in many countries is you end up doing the same thing again and again and again. And to be very honest, however enjoyable the nativity is as a story, if you do it in the same way when you're age 15 as you were introduced to it when you were 7, you're not going to learn very much. It's much better, as with any subject, to have a proper sense of progression. Influence community culture and power. Religions and non-religious worldviews interact with wider community and cultures. They affect the way communities have come to identify themselves over time by shaping their traditions, laws, political systems, festivals, values, rituals, and the arts. So just to interrupt and give a trivial example for 5 to 6-year-olds, this is where you might help them think about why Sunday in England is still most likely to be the day when more people don't work than any other day. Why there are holidays at Christmas, at Easter, but now increasingly, as we know, other times of the year as well. Some communities are influenced predominantly by one religion. More diverse and plural communities are influenced by several religious and non-religious worldviews, etc. And then the final one, trying to bring it together, the big picture, religions and non-religious worldviews provide comprehensive accounts of how and why the world is as it is. These accounts are sometimes called grand narratives. They seek to answer the big questions about the universe and the nature of humanity, such as, does anything exist beyond the natural world? Is there life beyond death? What is the path to salvation? And do we have one physical life or many? These narratives are usually based on approaches to life, texts, or traditions which are taken to be authoritative, and people interpret and understand these traditions in different ways. So the optimistic hope is that an RE curriculum based on those sorts of principles might be more engaging for 5 to 16-year-olds, would lead to better learning, would enable them to reflect about life and themselves more deeply, and ultimately might contribute towards helping the world to be a better place. Okay, finally, last section, last little chunk. Just thought I'd give some research data on science and religion among students in schools in England. And as a slight jump, last Saturday I was on holiday and we went to Chatsworth. So this is a photograph of Chatsworth, which is a phenomenal residence. And this was one of the works of art, which some of you may know. I did recognize it. It's a Damien Hirst. I quite like Damien Hirst, though I do realize I'm in a minority. So this Damien Hirst is called St. Bartholomew, Exquisite Pain, typical Damien Hirst title. And if you can't quite see, the point is it's basically got a human skin that he's holding. It's his own skin. He's been flayed. And the reason I put it up is because underneath there was a quotation from Damien Hirst, which I didn't know, I hadn't come across before. And he wrote, "I like the confusion you get between science and religion. That's where belief lies, and art as well." And there's a fine ambiguity in the word, I think, confusion, because we most often use the word to mean muddle, bewilderment, mess. Though, of course, its Latin roots, confundere, are to mix together. So I think as a metaphor for thinking about the relationship between science and religion, as most of us have spent years being used to other metaphors, it's one that's just worth keeping in mind. There can be good sorts of confusion as well as undesirable sorts of confusion. Now, this is a project funded by the TWCF on the same project that there's going to be a seminar tomorrow where other people are speaking about non-educational aspects of the project. And it's to do with 13 to 15-year-olds' attitudes to science and religion and the relationship between the two. So it's part of, as I say, the educational component of this project. And what we did was to develop an attitudes to science and religion instrument, a survey, a questionnaire. Quick health warning, you can't find certain things out from these sort of instruments as you can from in-depth qualitative work. So there are also interviews, which I'm not going to mention anything about today. You need the two usually to work together. The methodology is you search the literature because there are always existing instruments that do some of what you want to do, though interestingly enough, this is not a field that has been well colonized by psychologists, so many of the existing instruments have not been properly validated, and that is a great place to start because you can use the best of what's already been done, but then use very standard methods that I won't go into to try and ensure that your instrument is as valid as possible. I won't go into the full methodology, but you do your best. That you then show it to half a dozen people who are experts in the field. They improve it. You then do a pilot study. So we had just over 1,000 students doing the pilot questionnaire. You then do a lot of statistics, fiddling around, getting rid of items, rewriting and things like that. And you end up in the main phase with a survey which has 17 what are called constructs. Now, a construct is just a bundle of statements. And I will give you an example of the construct I'm going to say a bit about in a minute or two. But the constructs are all to do with students' experiences and attitudes to science or religion or both, and along various psychological measures, because it's always worth checking in these cases whether students are introvert or extrovert or have a high locus of control and various things like that, because these traits are quite well known to affect how people tend to respond to these sorts of instruments. And we've got a similar sample size, just over 1,100. Most of it is where you tick a box. So it's a 6-point scale. So you nearly always have at one extreme strongly agree, the other extreme strongly disagree. There are a few free response questions, and there were 18 schools in total. Briefly, you don't need, for the way I'll present results, to claim schools are representative. So you will not hear me stating things like 17% of students said X. Those sorts of statements, which are nearly always given, are only valid, of course, if you're confident that your sample is representative. Virtually no samples taken in schools are ever representative for various reasons. So what's much better is to look at internal correlations, which are much less susceptible to degrees of non-representativeness. Okay, I'm only going to talk about the construct, which is where students think that science and religion are compatible. So what this means is they are likely to agree or strongly agree with most of the following 6 statements. Science explains things in one way, religion explains them in another. Religion and science both explain the origin of the world in different ways. Evolution is God's way of bringing species into existence. I believe science and religion are compatible. My family believes science and religion are compatible. It is possible to believe in God and still hold the view that life on Earth, including human life, evolved over time as a result of natural selection. That's about the longest item we have. It's not ideal for 13-year-olds, but it worked in the pilot and it survived in the main phase. The putting those 6 things together into one construct is ultimately done statistically, so we didn't think all those 6 items would fit together originally. We thought several of them would, and then the computer, by a factor analysis, ends up sorting out what the constructs are. Now, I'll just give you the first one, and then I'll give you some more. So what you can now do is look, okay, the students who score highly on that construct, in other words, the students who think that science and religion are compatible, what are they saying in answer to all the other questions? Well, the thing they're saying most strongly, and R is a quite standard correlation coefficient, so without going into detail, in the social sciences, 0.4 is mid-range, it's not huge, it's not appalling. The thing they are most agreeing with is that science is of value because it can help to improve the world. This will become a common trope to anticipate ahead. These students who think that science and religion are compatible are very positive about science. They think that science is of value to society. They are aware of environmental issues. They score highly on critical thinking skills. In other words, we had a way of assessing whether we thought or not they were manifesting critical thinking, in other words, rigorous analytical logical thinking. They are extrinsically motivated, which means they think that doing science, if they were to continue with science, it'll be of value to them. It'll be useful for them, for example, for a job or something like that. Not very surprisingly, given that they think science and religion are compatible, they are more likely than other students to think that God exists. They're interested in doing science. They have a positive perception of science lessons. They see science and their own relationship with it pretty positively. And the 10th one, because these are in order, they are slightly more competitive than other students. From other research I've done previously, competitiveness seems to be quite a good measure for independent-minded. So girls who do well academically in schools always tend to score, on average, highly on measures of competitiveness, especially if they're choosing to do subjects that are not seen as girls' subjects. So, for example, if they're choosing to do physics. Those are the 10 top ones. For the reasons of time, I won't go over the next 5. And the last slide is you can then divide your 1,102 students into 2 groups. At one extreme, those who identify as being atheists. That's not the word we use. That's my classification for them. They obviously say, I disagree or strongly disagree with the existence of God and various other things. There's a cluster about being an atheist. Versus ones with the religious faith. And only 2 bullet points. Atheist students are more likely to report that they trust scientists. Now remember that the ones who saw science and religion as being compatible, in other words, they are positive about science, but they also have religious faith, they tend to be positive about science, but the atheists are more likely to report that they trust scientists and, perhaps unsurprisingly, more likely to see science as being the ultimate truth. However, there was no difference, and this is not a bad sample size, 1,102 for educational research. There was no difference between atheists and those of religious faith when asked about the benefits of science, for example, the value of science to society, when they talk about how positive they feel that science will be useful to them, the value of science to improve the world, or interest in doing science. So at least people who stereotype those who see science religions being compatible as not being as strongly interested in science as others, that's not borne out by these data. So to summarize, these students who see science and religion as being compatible are positive about science, positive about religion, and show good levels of critical thinking. Thank you very much indeed.